Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to Todos Santos. So the last couple episodes we spent filling in some gaps that were left in the city, and now we have this nice, continuous, urbanized landscape. And so we're going to be starting a new area here across the bay. This is going to be inspired by the town of Guaynabo, Puerto Rico, which is right next to San Juan in the analogous location. So to begin, of course, we have to get rid of all this temporary stuff that I did over here a long time ago. I do want to keep these interchanges, however. I made these off camera quite a while ago, just thinking they would be temporary, but I actually really like how they work and how they look. So they're going to kind of serve to define the main roadways of this area. Of course, the bridge is also going to help with that. We had that curved slope coming out of it. I didn't think that really made sense or worked. There's really no reason for them to do that when they can just do this straight section, which is going to be a lot cheaper and easier to build. So we have this really nice long slope, so you get a nice incline on the bridge, and all the trucks going up here trying to get to the downtown or whatever aren't going to struggle going up that slope. I also raised it up just a little bit on a causeway, I guess so the pillars don't have to be as tall. Kind of makes sense that it would be cheaper just to pile up some earth than to make taller pillars. I don't know. So I just left these little bits of interchange, and I'm just kind of treating them like if you were plopping down one of the vanilla pre-made interchanges and just moving it around in that way and fitting it into our more sensible freeway network. I'm really glad that I made these adjustments because we also end up with a smaller vicinity to work with for this new town, and it's a pretty big town. So if I had left it as it was, it would have been a way bigger project than I intended, and we would have ended up with something completely different than what we got. So the exciting thing about this town, or at least the exciting thing for me, is that it kind of signals the end of the continuous, dense urban fabric of Todos Santos. This freeway does. So the town is going to be fairly dense. It's going to be mostly made up of single-family homes, which as far as I can tell, Guaynabo is as well. But then on the other side of the freeway, the density is going to taper way off, and we're going to have lots of empty fields that have not been developed yet. There are going to be various types of surface water, rivers and lakes and reservoirs, and all that kind of interesting stuff that we're going to get on the outskirts of the city. Maybe we'll even do some agriculture. I'm hoping to be able to do something like that somewhere in the city, and I think this would be a good spot because there's lots of nice flat land. That's going to be fairly arable because we're going to have lots of rivers and stuff, like I mentioned. So when I first started laying down this road network, I wasn't quite sure where I wanted the actual town center to be. And what kind of naturally grew out of the build I ended up doing was that there are really two town centers. So one of them that we're going to build in a later episode is kind of where the main shoreline of Guaynabo is, where you get the Guaynabo ferry, which travels across to Old San Juan. We're going to do a fun ferry terminal build there and make our own version of that. But that's not what we're getting to this episode, other than laying down the basic roads for that. We're going to actually be moving the main city center that's inspired by Guaynabo down over by the harbor. And so the story that I've come up with for this town is that as Todos Santos has been deindustrializing a little bit. I mean, there's always going to remain some industrial business here, but for the most part, it's been turning into a service economy fairly recently. So anyway, as that's happened, some of the industry that used to be adjacent to the port here, the current port, has gone away and has been replaced with mostly residential development, some commercial, and office as well. Of course, as with many changes in cities, there are downsides and upsides. One upside is that we at least get to run our metro line through here. So it meets up right with the highway there. And then I thought the cheapest and most sensible way to run it from here is just to curve it around this interchange and not worry about interacting with the interchange at all. And it's going to curve off there and end up somewhere in the middle of that less developed area that I talked about on the other side of the freeway, where it's going to, well, the plan right now is to have it meet up with some commuter rail. That's basically an excuse for me to build some rail infrastructure, because for a while I had considered Todos Santos to be somewhere that wouldn't have intercity trains, but I can't stand not having trains in this city, so we're going to be doing that at some point. Okay, so we basically got the skeleton of the road network set up. You might have noticed that double roundabout there. I think it's called a Peanut Roundabout. I think I've heard it referred to as that before. There's a real one in Guaynabo. I think it's in Guaynabo. It might be in the neighboring town. But anyway, it's kind of in this vicinity, so I decided to recreate it there, and we're going to be detailing it later on. But now we're getting to the main residential roads of this town, which I ended up deciding to call Gatonia, because gato means cat, and then I wanted to have an Enye in there. Let me know if that's a really stupid name, but I thought it was kind of funny. And I didn't just want to reuse the real life name, because I want Todos Santos to have its own character. Anyway, so we're going to put down the roads of Gatonia. I basically just had Catania up on Google Maps and was kind of picking out the stretches of road that I found interesting and trying to translate that into the terrain and the context that we have here. So let's put down some roads. So that's the main road network of Gatonia, but we do have this one last street. I figured we needed another cross street. They kind of branch out from this roundabout, so I figured why not just have one coming out of this end as well. And then we have this interestingly angled intersection here, so I just need to add a couple slip lanes and bring up the corner offset with node controller, and it ends up looking really, really nice. So as we get into building the town, I want to stress, as usual, that this is not meant to be a recreation of what we're using for inspiration. I'm just taking bits and pieces and fitting it in a way that I think is fun and interesting and makes sense in the context of Todos Santos. So let's get going. One of the features that's going to define this town is this reservoir here. And I'm imagining that there's probably an input somewhere in here. I don't know if that's the right word, input, but basically there would be a buried stream that came in from the mountains and ends up here. And then that's going to turn into a river that then we're going to build that's going to run out to the ocean. And that's going to serve to facilitate some of our water infrastructure, but that's a story for another episode. I should also mention that there might be a couple parts of the road network that you didn't see in the time-lapse, and that's because I had to kind of divvy up some of the footage thematically over the course of a few episodes. So we're going to be jumping back in time in those future episodes to see how those were made. I just didn't have enough time in this episode to show all of it, and anyway, I thought it made more sense to have it in the episode where we actually do the build that uses those road networks. So all you're seeing right now is the stuff we're going to fill in this episode, if that makes any sense. So what we're doing right now is a couple of housing projects, and this is something I noticed in this part of the metropolitan area of San Juan, is that you have lots of these, I'm not so sure exactly what the term is, but something like a subdivision where you have public housing built. I'm not sure if it's always public housing, but you basically get these clusters of identical 3 to 4 story buildings. And sometimes you'll even have a couple of these subdivisions right next to each other. So we're going to build that right now. I'm using these Japanese buildings. They're not perfect. They don't perfectly represent the kind of building that I'm using for inspiration, but they're the right height and shape. And, you know, they have balconies and stuff. So I think they're close enough that they fulfill my criteria that they look right from a distance. And that's really what I'm going for with this part of the town, at least. We're going to be doing a detailed area as well. But I didn't want to focus on the details too much in these outer areas. And then, like I mentioned before, sometimes you have a couple of these right next to each other. So I'm just using different building styles for each of these. And then they usually seem to also have sports facilities integrated into them as well. In fact, that's true of a lot of the neighborhoods. So we're going to be doing that for the main residential area of Gatonia as well. But before we get to that, I wanted to detail this Peanut Roundabout because this thing is hilarious and I just really wanted to get to detailing this. So we're just going with the usual roundabout decoration with the red thing in the middle. You guys have probably told me exactly what this is in the comments by now, but I'm recording this before I have talked about this multiple times in this series, so yeah, I don't know what it's called. I also have a couple fountains. Ends up kind of looking like something familiar, but I'm not too sure about that. I thought this side of town, next to the freeway, around the fancy Peanut Roundabout, would be the newest part of town. So we have a new condo development using a Japanese apartment set from the same pack. And again, I think it looks generic enough for it to fit in. And just doing some bare detailing just to fit it in and blend it in nicely. Well, it's not really bare detailing, but it's not the normal process I would use to detail an area. And as a nod to the heritage of this area as being integrated into the port and the maritime history of the city of Todos Santos, we have this placeholder boat because I didn't have a fancy, squeaky clean looking boat that I could use as like a statue type thing. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's an actual boat that used to be used and it, there's some story behind it. And that might be even more meaningful. I'm also filling in the grass here with this nice mown grass decal. It just turned into a PO so it's easier to shape it to the environment because otherwise it kind of overlaps with everything. It doesn't look very good. Let me know what you think about that boat. If I should replace it with something a little more fancy looking or if I should leave that. So earlier I mentioned that this neighborhood is going to have a sports venue, which is sort of true. We have a baseball field there, but they usually seem to be, in these kind of circumstances, attached to a school. So I have this custom plopped school here, using a few different assets from various packs, and just trying to mix and match them into something that looks believable and also fits into this weirdly shaped block that we have here. I really like using this kind of structure for a neighborhood where you have the school and the sports venues at the center, because it just gives you a logical way to spread out your educational services across your city. So you don't have to worry about just kind of randomly plopping it on an arterial road or something like that. And it just gives you a sensible place to put down your schools. And it also looks really nice because it breaks up the pretty continuous swath of low rises that we get across most of Todos Santos. And that's definitely something you see in San Juan. You'll look down on it from above and you'll see lots and lots of houses. And then there'll just occasionally be like a set of like 4 baseball fields right next to each other or something. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that we were kind of moving Catano, or our version of Catano, down here. Now in real life, it's kind of more on the northern part of the equivalent shoreline in San Juan, and I wanted to move it down here. I don't know exactly why I did that, it just is kind of how it happened. But no matter why it's here, I wanted to have a nice park along the shoreline. And imagining that this used to be an industrial area, there were some docks here where there was some sort of industry, maybe like an oil refinery or something. But it has since been torn down and replaced with this nice new park. So I'm just using a terraforming road underwater to control the shape and the height of the land because the water's fairly deep here, so I wanted to get a nice smoother slope up to the shoreline so we can just have this single line of breakwater rocks that kind of stretches up the shore. And it leads up to that nice weathered looking Brazilian wall. And then of course we're using the usual amusement park path running through the middle of that just to get a pathway for the park. So for the main development of the town, we have 2 perpendicular roads. We have the main one that runs along the shore, of course. And then we also have this kind of Y-shaped thing where it splits out and turns into 2 one-way roads. So we have some commercial development along that one. We're also going to do some on the main shoreline road as well in a bit. But I wanted to start with this because it just seemed like a good opportunity to have a nice, dense cluster at the center of town. Of course, because we're a bit farther out from the city center, we're going to have quite a bit of parking as well. But I still wanted this town to have some density to it. Catano has an interesting feature, which is a very tall city hall in an otherwise fairly low-rise vicinity. So I wanted to have something resembling that. It's not going to necessarily be the city hall of this town here, but it's going to have a similar look, and maybe it would be a big hotel or something like that. So I'm using this asset. I'm not sure what it is. It might even be vanilla or like from the After Dark DLC, or I might be totally off on that. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a very beautiful asset, and we're going to be counterbalancing that beauty with a parking garage around back, because there's one in the real-life building as well. Also have this lovely theater asset that is also in the city's old town, so that's kind of cool that it's here. I try not to reuse these kind of iconic buildings if I don't have to, but I figured these parts of the city are far enough away that I didn't have to worry about that. Now with Gatonia, I'm going a bit less high density than Catania. So along this stretch of road, there are some older, low density houses, a couple 3 or 4 story buildings as well, but mostly these older, shorter houses. We're gonna have some commercial as well too, like I mentioned. Also this giant piece of graffiti, I assume like being on the back of the city's main theater in such a large size, it would probably be like a sanctioned piece of graffiti. So it's not really graffiti, it's just a mural. Now, because I resized this parking garage with PO so that I could fit it in, cars won't actually park on it anymore, so I just showed that it's closed with some of these cones. In Catania, there are a couple plazas here along the waterfront. I decided to just take the one of them that was closer to the road because it looked more straightforward, honestly, and I was being lazy. But I really like the look. I imagine that's like a place they could use for various kinds of events. Right now it's set up as like a little farmer's market or something like that with a bunch of different stalls. But we're going to get to the rest of the commercial strip here. And I'm going for a mix of like this fairly dense placement of buildings where they go right up to the sidewalk, and then we're having some off-street parking occasionally, here and there, just to kind of represent the transition from the more wall-to-wall kind of stuff to the stuff that's going to have setback parking and all the other signs of suburbia that you might expect as we transition away from the density of the city. I feel like I've been talking about that for like 10 or 20 episodes now, how we're like transitioning from the dense part of the city to the suburbs. But trust me, it will happen eventually where we'll start building some more kind of suburban and rural stuff. Now, I thought the park along the waterfront was a little bit bare, so I'm just trying to match this, I think it's like called a printed concrete decal or something like that. I'm trying to match that up to the vanilla pedestrian path color. It's not quite perfect, but it's close enough. And I wanted it to be quite accessible, so we have a couple crosswalks leading to those paths. And then, of course, we actually have some invisible paths clipped in there so people can actually go through and walk through this park, which, as usual, I use the Park Life DLC to accomplish that. You can see there are a couple Sims here and there walking along here. It seems like that would be actually a really nice place to walk along, because you could get a nice view of the port without actually having to go into the industrial area. And you could probably get a nice view of the castle from there as well. I think this would actually be a really lovely town to visit, especially now that we're starting to put down some trees. Wouldn't really be the same without those. I also had this pedestrian roundabout kind of thing at the tip of the park, and I'm just using this Park Life gazebo, which I just love the look of that asset for some reason. So I keep using it everywhere and kind of feel like I'm repeating myself with how I build these parks. So I might have to come up with a way to vary that up just a little bit. Now, plopping all these buildings was a very boring and tedious affair. But I quite like the final result, and I think it's a nice final bit of tightly packed development on the end of this side of the city, at least. There's still going to be plenty of that on the other side as well. But in this part of Todos Santos, at least, it's kind of on the fringes of density. Of course, this place is pretty disconnected from the rest of the city. The freeway runs right along here and kind of squeezes off any access to it, except for one small surface road. And otherwise, it doesn't really have a way to get to the rest of the city, so we need some transit. We have the bus line that runs along from the cargo port over to here. Like I said before, we're going to have a ferry down on the northern part of the shore as well, but that's for another episode. And then we're going to make a new bus line that's going to serve this western part of the city. It's going to connect up all the various towns we're going to build along the shoreline and also inland along the freeway. And importantly, it also runs over here to Puerto del Sol, where it's going to connect with the ferry terminal that, again, we're going to do that in a couple episodes. Oh, and I totally forgot to put down trees. I tried to go sparse, or at least a little bit more sparse than I am used to doing. Now, really quickly, before we finish out the episode, I wanted to go back to this more modern area right next to the freeway interchange and the Peanut Roundabout, and make a little bit of a shopping center and commercial district. It's not huge or anything. We don't have any like giant warehouse stores or that kind of thing, but I felt like we just needed a more modern and car-centric area next to the freeway, again, because this is a newer development. It's kind of a challenge to have an area built around a Peanut Roundabout, I found out, because it's basically completely made out of curves. So you need to have all these curved things that line up with it. So I tried to make it a little bit easier on myself on this next part. So we just have a giant paved over lot. And I think there's nothing wrong with that in this context because it makes sense for this, again, more car-centric area. So we have a fast food place and a gas station. It's not the most beautiful area ever created, but I think it serves well enough to decorate the entrance to this town. Also wanted another little bit of denser commercial along the main road, and this road is the one that goes all the way over to the shoreline and branches out into that Y shape, if you remember that. So it kind of serves as a nice transition between this commercial area and the town. Now we have an area at the edge of the city that's undeveloped, kind of as a hint of what we're going to be doing on the other side of the freeway. But this one in particular has been cleared, at least partially, and it's going to be used for some kind of development at some point. Now, I really want to hit 200,000 population in this city, and to start moving toward that goal, we're going to take a little journey to the edge of the map. I want it to represent that there are nearby cities that have their own governments, their own populations, but they contribute to the economy and to the metropolitan area population of Todos Santos. So that's why we have these, and it's a nice way to represent that, I think. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Todos Santos. I have been having so much fun recording these episodes recently, and I hope that you have been having just as much fun watching them. Bye-bye.